the issue of our talk today has to do with two things. You know, we're in a very, very noisy world. I don't know if you've heard the expression. But when you're dealing with social media, for those of you who are on any form of Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, you name it, right? It's constantly flooding your inbox, or if you're actually on the site, there's a lot of noise, a lot of emails that are trying to grab at your attention, certainly the media, etc. So we have a message, and we have an important message, and we want our message to be heard. The problem is that every time we send out a communication, who knows what else has just come into their inbox as well. And so we have to figure out, how do we go ahead and craft a message that's going to get people's attention? How are we going to do something that's going to keep people focused on who we are and what we're about? Because in this constantly changing world, it not only has to be front and center, but it has to stay there. We have to find ways to remain relevant to people without inundating them, okay? Because we all have had that experience as well, where initially you want to be on somebody's list. Let's say there's a motivational speaker, a great educator, somebody who writes and does all sorts of things that adds content and value, but you get too often, you know, in your inbox. Eventually, you're probably going to do what I do, which is to click on the unsubscribe button and get rid of that, and you don't want that to happen. So we have to be very careful. Just because we added someone to our list, doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to stay there, or that they're going to really be interested. They might not unsubscribe because they want to be courteous and respectful. They certainly don't want to get anybody at the school angry with them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're reading what you have to say. The other issue, of course, is general competition. Now, when I was a principal down in Atlanta, just to give you context, I was the principal of a Jewish independent day school. Okay, it was a K-8 school. And we sat, I guess you would say, to the right of the, religious or whatnot spectrum. But we had a number of schools that we were in competition with. A number of schools that parents, people in our community felt were legitimate options for their kids. And I suspect that everybody who's sitting here, you're here probably because you deal with this issue, I'm guessing. You probably have some degree where there's somebody who sits a little bit down the road from you, or somebody, maybe even they're farther away, but they offer some other type of value proposition that makes them attractive. So part of what we have to figure out is, how do we make sure that everybody sees the value proposition of who we are and what we offer and why we're, you know, better is a hard thing to say. You know, it's a little bit different when you're competing for students and when you're competing for regular customers. You know, I would feel a lot better if I'm selling a car to say how my car is better than your car. For me to put down another school always felt funny. It always felt a little bit like defeating the purpose of what we're here for. We're not here to make anyone else look bad. We're just here to bring people our way. Because we believe very deeply, I hope so, we believe very deeply in who we are as an institution and what we can offer. And we feel we have certain things that nobody else can offer, at least maybe where we are physically. You know, sometimes you just have a lot of schools, and it's hard to really distinguish one school from the next. It can be like you're splitting hairs a little bit, but that's part of what I think we have to talk about. So to list it in terms of objectives, which is always a good idea, I'd like to try to deal with the first two, and maybe the third if time permits. Number one, to discuss the importance of in-reach, including cultivation and training of your administration and staff. This may not sound like it's relevant to our conversation, but I think it's very, very important for reasons that we will discuss. And number two, to review steps that will help you craft or refine your message. So another way to look at it is to amp up your efforts, just a simple way to remember it. And oftentimes that's really good when you're talking about any type of marketing. AMP stands for internal alignment, crafting your message, and then finding a way by which to publicize it. Okay, if you amp up, I was sort of thinking of Hans and Franz for those of you who go back a little bit, pump you up, right? So it's a little bit different, but you get the idea. So jumping right ahead, as I mentioned before, I think outreach, and I'm defining outreach just in terms of working with our constituents, with our community, it really does begin with in-reach. And I think when we talk about in-reach, I'm referring specifically to sort of building the relationships and building the foundation. Okay, once we can all craft the greatest message in the world. I'll tell you a story that has sat with me for a really long time. During the Holocaust in Poland, in, I would like to say 1939, the first year of the war, there was a Jewish refugee who was studying in a Jewish school. and his last name was Shapiro, Chaim Shapiro, young kid at the time, maybe 16, 17 years old. And as luck would have it, you might be familiar that in 1939 in September, the Germans invaded Poland, and then the Germans and the Russians, who had formed a treaty prior to that, divided the country in half. So for a period of time, before the Germans then went and violated the treaty and attacked Russia, there was a period of time when Poland was divided half and half. Half in the hands of Germany, that was the western side of the country, and the eastern side of Poland was occupied by Russia. I tell you this because at the time that this particular area that this boy was studying was, let's say, invaded, etc., this boy wound up on the Russian side. And so during the war, he spent it in somewhere well into the Russian country land, beyond the line that would form. And he talks about his experience in a book that he had written, a memoir, his experience during the war. And he talks about how he was out in the fields in Russia, and they produce a tremendous amount of wheat, amongst other crops. But because of the war, and because of, I guess we would call it, inefficiencies associated with the communist structure, economic system, etc., he had bales and bales of this wheat that was out there that was rotting in the fields because there was no process in place to ship it. Meanwhile, you had people in Moscow and in Leningrad and all the big cities who were starving. And they had no access to the food because of the fact that it was there, it existed, but there was no means by which to get it to where it would really be valuable. The point I wanted to make is, you might have a great message. You, in your mind, might not have that value proposition that's going to sell your product, that's going to sell your school. But if you don't have the mechanism, if you don't have the system, if you don't have the alignment, if you don't have the agreement of the people that need to be partners with you to make all of that move forward, then you're going to be operating in isolation, and we can imagine the lack of efficiency associated with that. So creating that alignment is important because it builds the foundation, the rapport, etc., that's going to ultimately help you advance what you're trying to advance. And of course, it's going to bring many more minds to the table. And we know that when you have more minds in a conversation, you get really good things that come out of it. You know, when we come to the conversation that we're all in it together, when we come to the conversation that we need each other, I need you, because if you don't put together a good educational product, we're not going very far, right? We all know what happens when the teachers are not doing their jobs effectively, when the word on the street is poor. We all know that that makes our jobs significantly harder. The flip side of it is, right, you need them. Because if they're out there and they're not communicating the right message, if they're out there and they're not really communicating whatsoever, I had this all the time and I got better at it. But it was something, again, I'm talking from a principal's perspective. You know, the development director, the main fundraiser of our school, would reach out to somebody who participated, let's say, in a tax credit program that we had down in Georgia, or maybe just a general contributor to the annual fund. And the person would find out that way that there was a problem, let's say in a classroom, a problem with the educational administration, a problem in some other way. I bet you've all had that, just by a show of hands. How many of you had a similar experience where you reached out to someone? Are you renewing? Are you coming back to our school for next year? Are you dealing with enrollment? Are you dealing with tuition or something like that? And then you find out that someone was upset somewhere, and that probably could have been avoided with better communication. Have you had that experience? Oh, there you go. Okay. Guilty as charged. So we get the idea. We see how important it is. But if you are, in your own wonderful way, because I'm sure you're all great communicators, if you are presenting that challenge that you're up against in a way that people can work with, then you're not only going to help yourself to get more revenue and all the things you need to do, but really help the school grow. So it really is a team-related concept, and that's why the alignment piece is so important. Just to point out something in terms of communication and how we relate with each other, you might have noticed that thus far, I think, I've used 3 different approaches in terms of sharing information. I've spoken, so it was just regular, what we might call lecture. I've shared a few stories, and I've given you an opportunity to talk with each other. So using that sequence with me talking just as presenting content number 1, with storytelling being number 2, and with think, pair, share, or you giving others the opportunity, or you having the opportunity, I should say, to actually speak and engage, which one would you think was the most valuable? Please do the following. Take the hand that you feel most comfortable with, put it around your midsection area, and express your answer with a 1, a 2, or a 3. 1 would be me talking, 2 would be storytelling, and 3 would be think, pair, share, cooperative learning. Just in terms of what you found to be most interesting to you. For a second.
You're supposed to do it right now?
Yeah, please. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Can you do that?
You can. It's cheating, but okay. If you hide it behind the computer, I might not see it. Okay. So I'll tell you what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of 2s and a lot of 3s. Now, it's probably because I'm boring. But I think the real reason, honestly, and by the way, I don't think I'm boring per se, but I do know that this is really true. I figured that this would be the answer. I want you to think about that as you are thinking about what you do. Because the more that you tell stories, and the more that you give others the opportunity to talk, and the opportunity to invest in, the likelier it is that you will see that process move forward. Research talks about how when you get people talking, besides the fact that it brings out more positive, especially in face-to-face, they might be more inclined to say the things we don't want them to say in the water cooler type settings, etc., the back of the gym, or a carpool line, or something like this. But when you're talking to them directly, you do get, hopefully, a more balanced perspective. That's number 1. But number 2, if they're investing because they think you're listening, and hopefully you're being very attentive, and all of your body language expresses it as such. And body language includes proximity, includes eye contact, it includes all the things, moving your body in a little bit to show that you really care. If they sense that you're an open and willing, nobody expects perfection. As much as they might come across as expecting perfection, nobody does. But they do expect the opportunity to express themselves. And the more they do, and the more that they give you ideas, hopefully you'll integrate some of them if you can, but they'll be more invested in the solution. And then there'll be more on your team. There'll be more on your team. It's the idea of the more you put into something, the more invariably you want it to succeed, which is probably why someone like me would still be a Jets fan after all these years, for those of you who follow professional football, or any other example like that, because you invest in your team, you invest in your school, you invest in your community, whatever it might look like. So even when the chips are down, what's really working well, please?
My strength was, because I'm in admissions, it's similar to what you were saying. We use our administration and build upon what we as the salespeople have already stated. So they can give real examples and meet with families individually that have expressed an interest in coming to school, but they need just a little bit more.
Sure.
So that point of view from the administrator meeting together with admissions, with the family, makes them even more, makes the school even more pure.
That's great. Yeah, the administration is a very important piece, because that's ultimately the face of the school. People make, whether right or wrong, people make certain associations between typically the head of school and the institution. That's usually the main correlation. So the more that you can make a positive connection there, that's great. I'm just curious, did that initiate on its own, I guess we'd say, or is that something you had to nurture?
Well, we nurtured it when new administration came in.
You trained them?
Yes.
Come on over here. Let's have a little chat. I got it. Okay, nice. Way to go.
Do you mean like prospective families come in and visit with you and like the head of school every time?
Not every time,
okay.
But we do have to put together personalized things like that.
It can be hard to get the head of school
Yeah.
there. It also depends on the size of your school and how many new families you're looking at, in the time. I know that it was mentioned earlier today that there's admissions, all season is admission season, right? Is it rabbit season or is it duck season? It's admission season, right? We know that. So it's always going to be the case. If you could stagger it, you're going to position yourself better in terms of the administrator's availability. It happened to be that in my school, the office administrator, I turned her, because she had a marketing background, she was a very warm and personable type person, and also knew the community well. I also turned her into our admissions director had to take things off of her plate in order to be able to do that, but she also controlled my calendar. So she had a little advantage, perhaps that some of you may not have, I don't know, but the more you can get it on the calendar of the headmaster or someone similar that would be that face and sort of, seal the deal. That's going to work to your advantage. Great, thank you. Anyone else on what's clicking? I'm sure there are a lot of things. Anything else that sort of jumps out at you, where either through your efforts you've been able to get it to work even better, or you've just been very impressed with the way the administration has taken on this responsibility? Anything in terms of donor relations, leaving admissions for the side?
Part of the admissions, you have to have really open communication with the head of school because faculty recruitment is dependent usually on admissions as well. So it has to be a lot of open communication.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we're going to come back to community. Very important. Yeah, if you're not communicating a lot, it's hard. It's certainly hard. Anything else? Anything on the opportunity side? In the area where if you had your druthers, you'd be able to get this person or this group of people to do something additional that's going to make your life a lot easier. I'm not talking about adding staffing or reducing your hours or vacation week. I'm not going there right now. I'm talking about just in terms of the core constraints, if you will, of your present position. Is your hand up?
I think that in, I do marketing and communications, and so I think sometimes, probably most of us in this room, we are not in that sort of, those silos of lower school or middle school or upper school. So we sort of look at things from an overall perspective of how it could influence everything, how can we communicate it overall things. So if anything, there are opportunities for us. I mean, this is a purely simple thing, but it's like, you all know this at other schools. Uniforms, clothing, or carpool. You don't want to mess with any of that because it's going to drive you crazy. So we had our Easter chapel and our lower school, we've never run a carpool on a half day, and our lower school director said, we're running a carpool. And in the middle of it, it just was like, what? And so a little thing that was one little thing, but it had a huge impact on all of us and how we looked from the parent perspective that day coming up to pick up their child. Simple little thing, but a huge impact.
Yeah.
So that conversation.
Thank you for sharing that. I remember, it's a little bit of a sidebar, but I thought you'd find it interesting. I remember attending a presentation for heads of school when I was down in Atlanta. And the presenter, I think was from Colorado, had this slide up in his PowerPoint. It was for heads of school and board chairs and board presidents. And we're sitting there together, whatever the conversation was, and there was this slide that was entitled, Hills That Heads Die On. Hills That Heads Die On. And the list there was so, what's the word I'm looking for? It felt juvenile.
Right.
And one of them was reversing the carpool.
Oh, listen.
Turning it the other way, which maybe for efficiency purposes was the right thing to do. But because it hit the culture, because it hit the norm, we're creatures of habit. So anytime we ask people to change, we have to really think about what that is, what the ask is, and how that's going to impact people. And knowing that we have people that we can turn to and sort of get cross-representation from the faculty, from the administration, but also from all the key constituents that are going to be impacted by your carpool example, or by a communication change, or by a change. When I first arrived in Atlanta, we had a dress code. It wasn't a very, very formal one, but it was something that was designed to diminish, let's call it, competition amongst kids, and minimize the emphasis on fashion, and also create a certain, let's call it, decorum. And one of the things that, for whatever the reason, was on the permitted list were Crocs. Now, some of you might love Crocs. I have a set of Crocs. My kids say I need to replace them, they're old. But they're very comfortable. But I just had a hard time accepting them as being good for school. And so we had to come up with a whole process with the original dress code committee, bring them out of retirement, to somehow, so that it wouldn't be so clearly that, I was initiating it. But before we did all of that, there was a lot of conversation. And it still didn't go 100%. It's never going to be. But at least you tried. Thank you. Any other opportunities? I think a lot of us there's been a lot of head shaking as people have shared ideas. So I'm sure that if you have something to say, others will have a similar experience. Anything else? Okay, so let's move ahead. Right? Now, some of this we've already mentioned, but I think it bears repeating. So when we talk about advancement, we need to know, and everybody needs to know, that it's a school-wide effort. We can't just say that it's happening in one small area within our school. Remember, these are the people, the principals, the teachers, they're the ones who are living the mission. And they're also the ones who are in regular communication with your customers. And they are customers. They really are. You know, that's where the uncomfortable, fuzzy area between school and business, you know, comes into play. But in that respect, we do have to look at them as customers. And customer service is really important.